So let's start with the first presentation. I'm very happy to have Juan Monge with us, who is responsible for distributed solar analysis at Wood Mackenzie. He's based out of London today, talking to us from Spain, and mostly focusing on Europe, but also looking obviously at what's happening globally. Juan will give us some background on the latest demand developments globally. Juan, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Misha, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Real pleasure to be here with all of you virtually today. Thank you so much for having me. Like Misha said, I'm a principal analyst with Wood Mac. I'm responsible for our distributed solar research in Europe, but I will be talking about our global solar PV overview. We're going to emphasize our European outlook. We'll spend half of the presentation discussing our global solar outlook, and then we'll delve into Europe specifically, as I think that there's a lot of interest in the region, of course, because of what's happening with some of the PV components from China that are really targeting Europe as a destination this year and the last months of last year. So yeah, I can share my slides and I can kick off now. Give me just one sec. Perfect. So I think we're good to go. Yeah, we wanted to throw this question to the audience, right? Can Europe triple its solar capacity by 2030? Basically, when we look at the targets, the 2030 targets, 750 gigawatts that the European Commission has set, we're essentially talking about multiplying our cumulative capacity in Europe by 3.6 times, so probably almost quadrupling our solar capacity in less than 8 years. Our view is that we can definitely achieve this target, and I will explain a lot of the drivers that can get us there. But that target of 750 versus our base case scenario at Wood Mac, there's a bit of a gap, and it's a 140 gigawatt gap. So we'll go into some of the intricacies of that and some of the barriers that we think are holding the industry back in terms of reaching that objective, and how we can possibly overcome them, which we just need to address them. Like I said, I wanted to start by offering a little bit of an overview in terms of our global solar outlook, just to lay the land. Basically, this is the outcome of our latest forecast update. This is where all of the regional solar research teams at Wood Mac come together. It's an effort that I coordinated for our latest quarterly update in June. And basically, it's our view on decade growth for solar PV across segments, residential, commercial, industrial, utility scale, and across regions. The color divide will show you the regional spread for each of the years. And basically, it's a story of stable growth. That's something I really wanted to hone in today. We've had explosive growth in a lot of regions, exponential growth, particularly in Europe, definitely in the distributed solar PV segment last year, which is what I know best. And what we think will happen is that this growth will solidify across the decade. But there's a number of variables, including grid capacity, which is a huge factor, and the limits to grid capacity that will mean that the scale of this growth, or the explosiveness of this growth, will temper down to a certain extent. But roughly, when you look at the differences between years, we're talking about a solid 5% increases year on year, like across regions, which is a story of growth, of course. I wanted to spend some time looking at some rankings country by country, just to present our global view in terms of the countries that we think, of course, hold more potential when it comes to established markets. And then these are the top 20 markets when it comes to the total or the sum of solar capacity from 2023 to 2032. No surprises here. Of course, China is leading the pack, followed by the US. That competition for the first position, I think, will become even more aggressive as the US has seen like a lot of increases in our forecast derived from the IRA, and we can touch on that a little bit later. And then the chart on the right just shows the spread or the difference between the distributed PV segments and utility scale. Some markets are very interesting when you think about like that sort of share, right, between both sides of the meter, the Netherlands, for example, or China, because a lot of that growth for China, it's actually coming from the DE sector, residential looking incredibly strong, for example. So we think that that's just a very important thing to highlight as well when we think about these markets and we're looking at the forecast. All of the forecasts for all of these countries are segmented, and I wanted to clarify as well that because in our global solar PV view, we need to harmonize very disparate markets, very different markets, right? Like Taiwan has little to do with Pakistan, those two have little to do with France, imagine. It's important for us to harmonize our view on solar PV capacity growth by categorizing our segmentation by system size, which is not a perfect system, but works when you need to harmonize all the different territories. So up to 20 kilowatts, we consider that a residential installation, which is that purple color that you see on the charts. From 20 kilowatts to a megawatt, we define that as a commercial installation, standard commercial installation for a retailer, for an office space, a government building, and that's the magenta color. And then from a megawatt to 5 megawatts, that would be industrial, still behind the meter, but more, like your higher end of the CNI spectrum, so to speak, and that's the teal color. And of course, the orange represents utility scale. So anything that's above 5 megawatts, like I said, I know it's not perfect because obviously, and increasingly, there's a lot of large, very big CNI systems that are completely behind the meter, even completely islanded from the grid. But for now, it's the best way to really categorize all the growth across these 4 different segments within solar PV. I always say the same thing. It's important to look at numbers. We definitely really care about numbers, and we're very passionate about the details of the forecast at WoodMac. But what I always say is that we care even more about the reasoning and the factors behind those numbers. What I wanted to show you today as well, it's basically the outcome of our latest get together as the global solar PV team at WoodMac. We have talent in every region of the globe, and we're covering all the territories. And these 4 points really represent our thinking when it comes to the latest market developments we've seen and how they have impacted the latest version of the forecast, right? We think that 2023 will still be a record year. Some of that explosive growth will be mitigated to a certain extent in some territories, in certain segments, particularly probably thinking more about residential segments in some of the biggest markets in Europe. But overall, it's still a story of growth, and overall 2023 will be another record year for the industry at nearly 270 gigawatts DC. When we think about how those annual capacity levels will grow over time, like on that first slide that I showed you, basically that annual global capacity number grows to 330 gigawatts. There's a lot of discussions around, heightened geopolitical tension, like Misha was mentioning before. But we think that the bottom line is that in the near term, the next 5 years, the solar supply chain will continue to be dominated by China. My colleagues on on the supply chain and the technology team for solar at WoodMac. They've done a lot of analysis on the IRA and the Net Zero Industry Act, respectively. And our thinking is that though these two very important pieces of policy will start to shift the demand and supply dynamics and will certainly relocate some of the manufacturing capacity to American and European shores, we think that the overall impact won't mean that China will stop dominating the market as a technology provider. So that's very important to emphasize today. And then the fourth point there, of course, retail electricity rates are starting to fall. They have fell considerably in Europe. We're talking about an average 27% decline for Q1 2023. We don't think that this is a sustained decline necessarily. I think the keyword here is volatility, and it will still fuel growth for the distributed PV sector or segments in Europe. But a lot of that explosive growth, particularly within the residential segment that we saw last year, particularly in very strong markets like Spain, like Italy, Poland to a lesser extent, will be mitigated. And we can go into details farther down the line. I can answer any questions that you have, of course, on our global solar PV outlook and the details of those factors. I will delve into Europe now, but of course, there might be some specific questions about Africa or APAC that I might redirect to our broader team, and we can also do that if you can wait until I get back to you with some of those answers. So our Herculean task for European solar PV, can we bridge 140 gigawatt gap? So quick math here, we're talking about 210 gigawatts of cumulative capacity by end of last year. Of course, we have that 750 gigawatt target from the European Commission. And in our view, give or take, in our base case, basically Europe looks like a 400 gigawatt market in specific additions, right, from 2023 to 2030, which means that there's a little bit of a bridge to gap. And we can definitely bridge it. It's just a matter of addressing some of those fundamentals. Before we go into the main drivers and the main barriers to the European forecast, and again, this is across segments, the distributed side, as well as the utility scale side, I wanted to reflect on some of the big market developments that we've seen in the region in the last 3 months that have certainly moved the needle on the forecast. We think that the updated Renewable Energy Directive from the European Union, it's real good news. One of the hurdles, one of the bottlenecks that, of course, us and everyone in the industry has been hearing about for years, it's permitting bottlenecks. And we think that these measures will start alleviating a lot of that stress and a lot of that of those blocks, really. In markets that have been particularly hit by the inability to get projects off the ground as quickly as you should or as you would. Italy, for example, it's a really good market to highlight on that side of the equation. And we think that new law in February 2023 simplifying the permitting process and introducing this idea of administrative silence, right? Like setting a limit for 150 days. We think that that's really good news for the industry there. And of course, we have the acceleration areas. So all of that has certainly boosted our latest edition of the forecast. And then on the other hand, we think that the updated national energy and climate plans will be a fundamental driver, a fundamental tool to really pump up those solar PV targets. The best example of that, it's probably Greece, right? Where we recently saw the solar target being doubled pretty much in the last couple of months. So all of this is just really bringing more momentum to the forecast. I've already covered some of those fundamentals, right? When we're thinking about the EU target, the EU solar strategy, that 750 objective, 750 gigawatt objective, and then we're thinking about the national energy and climate plans and what that's going to do to national solar targets, particularly in less mature markets or markets that are still a long way from being saturated like Greece. That's the probably more on, I mean, definitely both on the utility scale front as well as DG, but then when it comes specifically to our residential and our C&I segments, for anyone that's looking at Europe, that's active in the region, this will be no surprise. As part of Repower EU, the Commission is really prioritizing making the most of European rooftops. And there's very important pieces of policy in the form of mandates that will have a drastic impact, we believe, when it comes to residential and commercial installations. Now, the devil's in the detail. I would define everything that's said in Repower EU when it comes to these solar mandates. I'm specifically thinking about the residential mandate for new construction for 2028, as well as the commercial mandate on 2026 for new office or government spaces that are bigger usable surface that's larger than 250 square meters. And then next year or the year after that on 2027, that will impact any existing office spaces, whether it's new construction or not. Like I was saying, we think that this policy, it's more direction of travel as opposed to a solid regulation. There's a lot of questions on the table that need to be answered. And we need to understand, will this regulation actually become a EU regulation? Will it be a directive? How will it be transposed at a national and a regional level, right? What will be the exemptions, particularly when it comes to the residential side? There's a lot of things that haven't really been defined, so we need to understand, but we know how the Commission operates, and we know that they're certainly setting a path. The question is pretty much, how will this be transposed at a national level, and what will be the exemptions that will be included for these rooftop mandates? LCOE improvements, we are thinking that, roughly anything from a 53% LCOE decline for technology cost, for fixed tilt racking utility scale solar systems, down to more of a 30% LCOE cut by the end of the decade, by 2030, for residential solar PV. So obviously LCOE improvements are also a driver to our installation forecast. Cell efficiency, seeing increases roughly of 5%, will also really drive numbers. And then corporate PPAs, of course, and the acceleration that we've seen in that space is also fueling the forecast. Now, I'm conscious of time. We also need to talk about barriers, and going back to my point about that 140 gigawatt gap, what are the things we really need to fix in Europe to actually not only achieve, but even surpass that objective? Grid capacity, it's the elephant in the room, right? And the problem with that, it's not just a question of whether we can allocate all the solar PV that will be built into our T&D infrastructure, whether we have enough capacity to actually, interconnected. I think the problem, it's a lot more complex than that. That has implications on net load, right? We're working at the solar team, we're working very, very closely with our core power team for Europe. They spend their entire day thinking about wholesale price curves and grid capacity, and the tremendous bill that we are projecting on the solar forecast. There's clearly a lot of friction there when it comes to net load, which obviously impacts price cannibalization and basically capture prices. Markets like Spain, that is particularly worrying because, of course, at a product development level, product by project, that is really impacting IRRs, and which we're seeing that and we're hearing that from large-scale developers right this minute. So it's definitely something we need to fix. Energy storage, large-scale energy storage, and actual mainstream deployment of storage technology. It's potentially one of the solutions, of course. There's dynamic line rating and grid modernization technologies that could potentially alleviate some of that stress, but that's definitely one of the elephant in the room, as I was saying before. Supply chain risk, as it pertains to any disruption to your manufacturing lines, your supply chains. Obviously, We should have this very recent in memory with everything that happened with the pandemic and having manufacturing sites closing. There's a question around European vulnerability when it comes to our dependence on Chinese technology, of course, and there's an effort to rebalance that with that 30 gigawatt objective for solar PV components that will be onshore, that will be manufactured in Europe. But that still poses a risk to the forecast, not being able to hit that target, or even that target not being sufficient, not being enough to guarantee strategic reserves, as I've heard it referred to in the industry of solar PV technology. Permitting bottlenecks and financing hurdles, probably more of a short-term risk. We definitely think that by mid-decade, these two things will really be alleviated, but it's something we still need to be discussing today in 2023. We can tackle any questions. Of course, I already see questions, Misha, so we can cover those later, but this is kind of swimming into the DG space, which is really the area that I know best. This is our latest update. So basically, the big story in the last 3 months, I think, is that 27% average decline when it comes to retail electricity rates. We have seen some reaction to this when it comes to installation numbers, particularly in one of the strongest markets like Spain. Residential installations are 25% down, and that's Q1 data, Q1 2023 data versus Q1 2022. So I think that there's clearly a reflection of some market stabilization, some supply and demand stabilization. That segment, we think it's particularly reactive when it comes to what's happening to electricity bills. Customers tend to have a short memory sometimes. So that's probably the biggest story there this quarter. And then the chart on the right, that gives you an understanding of which markets we see leading the pack when it comes to the DE segment. Again, this is both the residential as well as the C&I sites. And that figure, those figures in particular, that's the sum of all of our distributed PV installs from 2023 to 2032. So yeah, I wanted to maybe spend, I think I have like a minute left, really talk about some of the drivers that are very specific to distributed solar PV. I've divided those in near-term factors as well as long-term variables. Obviously, policy, it's really driving the sector still to this day, pretty much a combination of policy incentives as well as what we were talking about when it comes to retail electricity rates, which was the main factor pushing that explosive growth for residential and C&I last year, which has been mitigated to a certain extent in some markets, particularly in Spain, particularly in Italy. And then, of course, we could break down the policy component into all those different variables, the CapEx rebates, like direct subsidies, compensation for grid exports, basically a transition from net metering to net billing, as we saw in Poland. But I really don't want to delve into too much detail. If we have any specific questions on DG, we can definitely tackle those in the discussion. And then, of course, the barriers to DG in some cases are really similar to like the overall sector and even utility scale when it comes to the impact of inflation, the impact of interest rates, the impact of grid congestion and price cannibalization, and the impact of supply chain risk. But then something that's very specific on the DG front is the lack of installation crews, right? And I think this is a good note to end the presentation, because I know it's something that we will be discussing on the panel later. But basically, there's a little bit of a gap. We know that there's a lot of technology supply, modules, inverters coming from China, but we think that there's also a lot of floating stock sitting in warehouses. One of the reasons why that is happening, it's because we don't have enough manpower to install all the residential and all the C&I we need to be installing, and to really match that demand from our European regions. So I will end with this statement. Like I said before, 140 gigawatt gap that we need to bridge, that we can bridge, but that will only come if we fix supply chain risk, if we alleviate grid constraints and the impacts of those, price cannibalization, capture prices, etc. And if we fix permitting bottlenecks. And to end on a positive note, we know that from a regulatory perspective, we're starting to fix permitting. We have administrative silence, we have 150-day limits, so we're moving in the right direction. And we will very likely see updates to the forecast where we see that gap shortening and shortening until we can probably confidently say that Europe will hit that 750 gigawatt objective. Thank you very much.